until midday. This is the morning program with Liam Bartlett.
24 minutes to 10, 17 degrees in Perth at the moment, heading for a high of 19 today with the odd shower. I'll take some more of your calls about this impending final series here in Perth a little bit later in the program, but let me give you a hypothetical this morning and see what you think about whether we need to amend the law to protect our children from sexual predators. Now, say you were renting a home and you were told by the landlord to leave your bathroom window open just a little to guard against mould and humidity because the ceiling fan wasn't enough. And then down the track, that same landlord was discovered using that same window to spy on your adolescent daughters. Now, in this particular case, his Peeping Tom Act led to an arrest and a charge. But it turns out, because the girls weren't touched physically, this landlord gets off scot-free. The charge has been dropped. The girl's mum, Liz, joins us this morning. Liz, good morning to you.
Good morning, Liam.
Thanks for having a chat to us about this. I think it's very important.
Oh, my pleasure.
Look, without naming names, obviously, can you tell us a bit more about how this came about?
Yeah, sure. So my family, including my mum and dad and I, were looking for a rental. So we were planning on building a house with an auxiliary area for my mum and dad to live in.
Yeah.
So we both sold our properties, and this was at the very beginning of COVID in March last year, just prior to when the lockdown started. So we found a nice house to live in.
Yep.
And the landlord was going to continue living on the property in a granny flat that was detached from the house.
Okay, so the landlord sort of lives out the back, down the backyard.
Yeah, kind of. That's right. And we signed a formal lease agreement, agreed on the pool area, etc., being a common area.
Yep, all that.
Yep. And a few weeks after we'd been there, he kept mentioning the bathroom window. And he must have noticed that the girls were not having a shower with the bathroom window open, because a few weeks later he came in with a drilled a hole in the bottom rail of the window, which the window was a high window. So anyway, he drilled a hole in it and put a screw in it so they couldn't shut it.
Oh, I see. Yep. So the window couldn't physically be shut.
Yep. So
did you think that was a bit weird, a bit strange?
I removed the screw because, as far as I'm concerned, my teenage daughters should be able to have a shower with the window shut if that's their choice.
Totally.
I removed the screw 3 times before eventually he stopped putting it back.
So he kept coming back to put the screw back in to replace it?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then when did you realise you had an issue?
Well, it's funny because the girls had bad vibes from the landlord. They wouldn't swim in the pool in their bathers. They would only swim in the pool in shorts and T-shirts. And there was a few other odd things that my cousin, who was living with us at the time, noticed as well, and we just kind of thought it was, a little bit creepy, but...
And when did you realise you had an issue, Liz? Sorry to rush you along here, but I just got a time element. Yep. I just want to cut to the chase. So,
yep.
So when did what one of your daughters had a problem first on her own?
Yep. So it was in the May. So we'd been in the house about 6 weeks, and she looked up at the window that she had opened while she was in the shower, and saw him looking through the window. However, she just sloped down the wall, sat on the floor in the shower and cried. and never mentioned it to anybody else.
Well, she would have been embarrassed too, and
And
all sorts of things.
And although they're twins, their personalities are just very, very different.
And what was he doing? Just standing there watching?
Yep, standing on a stool outside the window watching.
Outside the window, which technically is still on his property.
Uh-huh.
Okay, and then your second daughter had an experience.
So then in the November, my second daughter had the same experience. She heard a noise outside and looked up at the window and saw him looking at her. And I heard her yell something out, which I thought she was yelling at her speaker or something that wasn't working, properly in the shower. But seconds later, she comes running out in full-on, protection mode with a towel just grasped around the front of her, and told me that she'd seen him looking through the window.
So he's doing the same thing. He's standing there on a stool, staring in, just staring at your daughter's naked in the shower.
Yep.
So you called the police?
Certainly did. I confronted him first. Called the police. The police came. They were there for between 4 and 5 hours, I think it was.
Yeah, well, they must have thought, they must have thought you had a pretty good case. And clearly they believed both the girls, because he was charged by WA Police with indecently dealing with a child of or over 13 and under 16. But, again, moving forward a few months, the police's attempt to prosecute went awry when he had his charge dropped. So the Director of Public Prosecutions made a decision that they were going to discontinue the charge because the evidence was not capable of proving the elements of the charge, as they put it.
Because he didn't ask them to touch him, or he didn't touch her, or he wasn't committing a lurid offence.
Act.
Like masturbating in front of them or something. None of the laws that exist here in WA could stand up
to what
in court to have him charged.
To what he did. So in the eyes of the law, in the sense, he's completely innocent, which is mind-boggling, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Considering I now have two daughters who one is severely depressed. The other one is so anxious about everything, where, spending so much time going to psychologists and doctors, and meanwhile he gets to live his life and go on with his business that he runs. And
we've got to say, we've had some good conversations with the Director of Public Prosecutions about this, and it's certainly not their fault. I mean, they can only deal with the laws that they've got. But they say that to successfully prosecute this bloke, the state would be required to prove that he dealt with your daughter or daughters, which is exactly the way you've described it. In other words, physically have done something. So it's not enough for him just to be perving on them. But even from what you describe, it's pretty amazing because he clearly set up the whole thing.
Absolutely. And he groomed us from the time we went and inspected the property. He was probably thinking, this is going to be good.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah, and I just think that the time is now that it needs to be changed. If we were in New South Wales, and I also believe Victoria, they already have a law in place for such a crime, but unfortunately we don't here. So I think the best thing that can come out of a terrible situation is that we prevent this being able to happen to anybody else.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And Liz, I take it that you've moved house.
Yes, we have.
Yeah. Look, thanks very much for sharing the story. I hope the girls end up okay and they get absolutely 100% right very, very soon. But I appreciate your time this morning. I'm going to continue this conversation, Liz, because as you have just pointed out quite rightly, and the state prosecutor has reinforced this, there is no law preventing this kind of offence in WA. Now, if you find that's weird as well, give us a ring, 133 882. So in New South Wales, under the Crimes Act, a charge for voyeurism could be possible, which makes sense, doesn't it? Now, there's a penalty of 2 years in jail there if a person, for the purpose of obtaining sexual arousal or sexual gratification, observes another person who is engaged in a private act without the consent of that person and knowing that the person being observed does not consent. Now, if that person happens to be under 16, which was the case for one of Liz's daughters, the maximum penalty is 5 years in jail. The UK also, under its Sexual Offences Act, has similar provisions with a maximum penalty of 2 years imprisonment. But the other disturbing thing I think about the outcome of this case is that we know from criminal case studies that many sex fiends begin as peeping toms and graduate, of course, to crimes that are far worse. Susan McLean spent more than 27 years in the police force, many of them working with children as the victims of sexual abuse. Susan, good morning.
Good morning, Liam.
Susan, thanks for your time today. What do you make of this bloke being allowed to simply walk away from the law?
Well, it's terrible. There's no other word for it. And it just shows the clear deficiencies in the laws of Western Australia. Compounding it, of course, is the fact that he was technically on his own property, which adds another layer to the difficulty in dealing with these sorts of crimes.
Yeah, absolutely. So as it stands, the law doesn't allow for this to be considered a crime because essentially there's no physical contact, no physical contact. But
no,
and
the law's clear in it. It gives 3 examples of what the conduct is. If it doesn't fit that, there is the assumption that the crime has not been complete.
Right. As an act, as an indecent act.
As an indecent act.
Gee, it's a fine line, isn't it, really?
It is a fine line, and it's not that he stumbled across them or inadvertently happened to be walking down the side of the house when they were showering. It's clearly there is intent. It was a deliberate act. So all that needs to be fed into the consequences of the crime. But, I really feel for those young girls. It's just an abhorrent act. It's an invasion of their privacy, a gross invasion of their privacy. And it should be a wake-up call to all the decent citizens of Western Australia that they need to agitate to get the laws changed.
Did you find from your experience that these sort of offenders would graduate to more physical crimes?
Yes, many of them did. It's the same as in the online world. A lot of them start with just looking, and then they move to what we call contact offending, where they are actually either engaging in that lewd act right in front of the victim, or they are sexually assaulting the person. And there's been many cases that I'm in recent times in Victoria, albeit involving adult victims, but the offender has started by looking at them through windows and things like that. Interestingly, if he had been filming them with a covert camera, the outcome might have been a little bit different because those offences are a little bit easier to deal with.
Again, yeah, it's fascinating when you drill down on the law at that level, but gee whiz, it's a big hole. Susan, thank you very much for spending time with us.
That's my pleasure, Liam.
Susan McLean on the program. What do you think? 133 882, that someone can get away with that sort of clearly premeditated act because our law just does simply not cover it. 10 minutes to 10 on the morning program.